My dad was an artist, and he did illustrations, and he was a kind of a graphic artist, and a big portion of his work was magazines and publishing magazines and books, and he was in charge of the whole operation of doing that. But around the house, as a little kid, I knew my dad, and I was very close to my dad. We did a lot of stuff together. And I knew that on demand, he could draw an airplane or a car whenever you wanted, And so if I was bored, I'd say, draw me a car. But mechanically, my dad was not very good, fixing things, repairing things, and so forth. And from a very young age, I started kind of being in charge of repairing things, because I could take things apart and put things back together, and I could see in my head how they were supposed to go. So I could take things apart, and generally I could put them back together. Sometimes there was a failure in the putting them back together, but it's a telephone that never worked again. But anyway. And this is, my dad, so I kind of knew him as a great artist, is an amazing person, but also kind of a lovable goofball. And sometimes I would go up to the office with him in the evening, and he would draw and do our stuff like that, and I just hang out with him. But then later when I got older, I was 12 or 13 or something like that, he let me come to the office with him during the daytime, during when the office was functioning and working and so forth. And that was, my whole understanding of my father changed. I saw him telling people, oh, this is how this needs to be done, in all sorts of printing processes and how things work and so forth. And there's a lot of complexities to printing, especially. It's changed quite a bit since then, but and you are always having to do a lot of problem solving when you're printing a book. It is, because things aren't working out right or not fitting or whatever. And he was doing all this math in his head. I didn't know my dad could do math at all. But this was his area of expertise, and this is what he did. And I just saw him in such a different light, He seemed to know what he was doing. So there's a moment there where my understanding of my father changed quite a bit. And I started to see him in another light. I think that happens with a lot of us. I think we can see a person, we get to know a person in one context, but then we see them in another context, and it totally changes our understanding of who that person is. Last Thursday, we celebrated the Feast of the Transfiguration. In that situation, Christ went up into the mountain with several disciples, and he changed, his nature changed. His divine nature was shown to the people. The disciples who went there saw him in his glory. They saw him shining whiter than white. The disciples, of course, didn't know what to do about this. They were totally they had no idea. They were shook up by this. They didn't know how to respond to it. But as they went back down the mountain, and so they went back into their lives, they had a totally new understanding of Jesus. I mean, they had seen him in one context. They'd seen him working with the people. They'd seen him do these miracles. But here in the Transfiguration, they saw him in a different light. Today, we look at a wonderful story in the gospel that I really enjoy myself, the being in the boat out in the sea, because it's such a visual story. I can see myself in that scene, and I can picture it and have a feeling for it. I wish I had a boat here so we could use it as a prop, but didn't really want to spend the money. But this is the story that in this story, the sea that is tossing around and in the midst of the storm and everything, the boat is going back and forth, and That's life. That's the world. That's greatly the evil of the world. It's all those things that are going on outside, beyond these walls. In many ways, this is our little boat here that we get in, and we find peace in this little boat with Jesus. But out in the world, you have violence. You have people injuring each other, killing each other, stealing from each other, rioting, destroying. There's all sorts of conflicts that don't need to be conflicts out there. There's so much in the business world of the United States about trying to get money out of people, you know. And we spend a lot of our lives kind of defending ourselves from that stuff, finding our little safe havens where we can get away from that kind of thing and try to live a peaceful life of some sort. But in this situation, first of all, he sends them out into this storm. He sends them out into the sea, and he goes off to be with his Father. He goes off to peace while they go off to turmoil. They go out into the world. He focuses on his Father. And in finding his Father, he finds peace, and he has an understanding. And then he goes out walking on the water. And this sea is churning, and it's a mess. The waves are coming in and back and forth, and then he comes to the boat, and they start to have this interchange about, oh, who are you, so forth. And Peter says, if you call me, I will come to you. So there's a call and response. He hears the call to enter into Jesus' world. Now, Jesus is walking through this water without any difficulty. The waves aren't affecting him. He's oblivious to the craziness of the world. And he has a focus. He's spent time with his Father, and he holds that in himself. And so Peter, the bravest of the bunch, steps out of the boat and walks towards Christ. But there's a very important line in the readings at this point. And it's kind of the key to the whole story. Let's see. Must be the wrong ear. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened and began to sink. That's a key line in that whole thing. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he got frightened. So he's out walking on the water, focused on Jesus, going towards him, and doing fine. But then he looks around and he sees this wind. And he loses his focus on Christ. And he focuses on the details of the world around him, all the stuff that's going on. And, and you can sit down and say, oh, why are those people doing that? Why is this happening? Why, what am I going to do? What if the riots, affect my life? If they rob my store or whatever? You get tangled up into the mess of the world. And when he did that, he started to sink. When he caught up in that world around him, when he let the fear of that world around him drag him down into the water. You start getting all this crazy stuff about, you can moan and whine and carry on and complain and so forth. Bernice and I do this. This is kind of one of our things is we get hold of some piece of news and then we fight it out together. Bernice and I could save the world, I think. We're on top of it. But we get tangled up into the stuff, the crazy stuff that's going on in the world. And Jesus then comes to him and grabs hold of him. Here we have that wonderful image of the divine coming down to grasp the human. We can see the little boat being tossed around on the water. And first he's going to save Peter. He pulls Peter back up, and it's fine. He can walk on the water again. He can walk through that crazy world. I'm not saying that we'll be oblivious to the stuff going on in the world. And we often may be affected by the stuff going on in the world. But in our relationship with Christ, we will go through that in a much more peaceful sort of way. It won't drag us into fear, anxiety, distress, which will then cause us to be defensive and lash out and be overprotective. We won't overreact. You start getting into the world, you get into this idea of something happens, then you overreact, and they overreact, and they overreact, and then we have this explosion of problems. Worried about Beirut right now, that people are starting to lash out against the government, so this is starting to cause turmoil that's going to make the situation worse. But anyway, when his focus he's pulled back up out of the water, his focus returns to Jesus, and then things are calm, they're manageable. And they both go to the boat and get back in the boat. And then an interesting thing happens there. We don't really talk about it much in there, but as they were in the boat, you can imagine being in the boat, rocking around, afraid of what's going on, and kind of trying to see what's going on out there. They're kind of a bunch of people in a boat. Is that what we are? If we're in this room right now, are we just a bunch of people in a boat? Are we getting tossed around by the waves together? Or when Jesus gets in the boat, they all focus on him. And the situation in the boat becomes calm. And they become kind of unified. They're come together. They realize their commonality, that they're brothers and sisters. And they're brought together. And we become connected to Christ. Christ becomes our companion on the journey. And we are entangled with Christ, that we become closely bonded to him. And this is what happens here when we receive communion. We're closely bonded to Christ. He becomes part of us. We become part of him. There's an entanglement between us that is the closest relationship you can ever imagine. It goes beyond being husband and wife or mother and child or anything else. It is this bond between ourselves and Christ, which then between us we can then are able to follow him and carry out his mission in the world. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to carry out his mission in the world. We're called to be bonded to him. And we go back out into the sea again. We get back out of the boat and we go to find others. We pull them up out of the water and we bring them to Christ. The angry sea. It's easy for us to see, it's easy for me to see the world as an angry sea. But Jesus is the calming factor. He's the one who's going to bring order to the mania of our world. He's going to allow us to be his disciples and share with him that work of salvation.